Hi, I'm meteorologist Pete Mangione, and welcome to another edition of the Sonoran Sky Podcast. And today's topic will be climate change, snowfall, and the winter economy. And this is a topic I am personally very interested in because I am a skier, and I have been noticing weather patterns changing when I go up skiing over the past few years. So I want to welcome our guest. Her name is Dr. Elizabeth Burakowski. She's a research associate professor at the University of New Hampshire. Dr. Burakowski, welcome to the Sonoran Sky Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
All right, so let's get right into it. I actually was just out skiing in Colorado a couple days ago, and the snowpack there, I'll just put it mildly, is not great. How is climate change affecting snowfall and snowpack, especially when it comes to skiing?
Yeah, we're going to separate this into snowfall and snowpack. So, snowfall is what's actually falling from the sky, and we would typically measure that in a rain gauge. So, we'd get the water equivalent out of that. And snowfall is going to be dependent on how warm the atmosphere is, it's going to be dependent on how much moisture we have available as well. So, as we shift into a warmer climate, and to be clear, across the United States since 1970, all places in the United States have been warming. New England is a winter warming hotspot, so we've warmed over 5, 6 degrees Celsius since 1970. And over since the past 55 years or so, Arizona and Colorado haven't been warming at quite the same rate. They're closer to 2 to 3 degrees of warming. But what that means is the closer you get to that melting point of water, the more likely your winter precipitation is going to fall as rain instead of snow. It also means that you could end up with more snow drought, which is essentially what is happening in Colorado and the Southwest in general right now, is that you're in a deficit of snowfall. Then there's the snow pack. That's what is actually staying on the ground and what we're recreating in. So when you go to a ski resort and there's no snowpack, that's a problem. And that's going to be a factor of not just the snowfall, what's coming from the sky, but how warm those temperatures are or how cold they are to either melt the snowpack or preserve the snowpack. So here in the Northeast, we've had a relatively cold start to the winter time. So we actually have a pretty decent snowpack going on right now. I got to recreate in it up in the White Mountains. We have our own White Mountains here in New Hampshire. And I hear you out west, like your experience, the snowpack, one, it hasn't been accumulating due to a lack of snowfall. And two, warm temperatures, anything that does fall has been melting.
So it sounds like what you're saying is when it comes to these, longer term projections, everyone is going to be affected when we're talking about the ski resorts across the United States, but the Northeast will be probably a little bit more affected than we will at places like here, for instance, Snow Bowl in Arizona, resorts like that. But the effect will be even more pronounced there in the Northeast where you have, I'm going to try to jog my memory of places I've skied in the Northeast. Stowe, is there a Jay Peak,
Yep.
Cannon, places like that even more affected?
Yeah, I mean, when we're seeing winter warming rates this high, that's times when you're getting closer and closer to the freezing point. So my parents, for example, they grew up skiing in West Virginia and New Jersey. And today, those locations typically have winter temperatures that are going to be below what you would call a threshold for keeping a snowpack. So it's above the freezing point. So you're now looking at temperatures that are melting snowpack, and you have a much harder time sustaining that. Future projections suggest that the length of the snow season in the Northeast is going to shorten. And if we continue to burn fossil fuels at the rate we've been going and even continue to develop fossil fuels, then we're going to start seeing even more warming on top of what we've already experienced. So by the end of the century, a place in the Northeast that typically would have had maybe 3 or 4 months of snow is going to probably be down to about two, maybe even 1 month of snow, depending on where you are in proximity to the coast and how low elevation you're looking at.
And for locations like Snow Bowl here in Arizona, where they've had a bit of a rough start to the season, one way they do get by is by making snow, which leads to often a decent snowpack, even if it hasn't been snowing lately. Do you think these long-term projections could make it more difficult for some of the resorts to make snow to get them through some of the tough times?
Yeah, when we think about making snow, there's two components that really drive whether or not this is a viable climate adaptation strategy. So, one component is where is the water coming from? And in the Northeast, we generally don't have much of a shortage of water. We have snowmaking ponds that folks can derive water from either precipitation or from nearby rivers and lakes. Or you end up in a situation where you have a drought and those water ponds don't um, they're not filled as easily. So you end up with a shortage. When you're in the Southwest, water is a bit more short supply compared to the Northeast. And so there are pressures in terms of water rights and water management that could limit the snowmaking operations in a place like Arizona, where we might not feel as much pressure in the Northeast. The Northeast also tends to have quite a bit more infrastructure for that. So in the Northeast, well over 50% of the skiable terrain is available with snowmaking. But when you're looking at places like the Southwest, it's considerably less than that.
And I know you've done some work with, economy revolving around snowfall and snowpack. Why is the winter economy so important in terms of its impact on the entire economy here in the United States?
Well, it's not a small chunk of change when you are looking at winter sports, specifically skiing, snowboarding, and snowmobiling. It ends up being an about a $12 billion economic industry. So it's quite a driver, and especially for states like Colorado and California, you're also supporting tens of thousands of jobs. In places like New Hampshire, it's a bit smaller, but it's still pretty mighty. And when I look at a place where I live in the northern counties of our state, up to 50% of our visitor spending can come from the ski economy. So when we have low snow years, that can mean less jobs. It can also mean less state and tax revenue that's coming in through the state.
And have you been noticing changes, or do you expect future changes in the start of winter and the end of winter? Because what I've anecdotally noticed is that there seem to be many years now where the winter starts, nothing happens, and then you think it's going to be a bad season. But then sometimes March, April, you get these late winter and springtime type storms that sort of extend the winter to a later period than they would normally extend to.
Yeah, but our experience in the Northeast has been a little bit different. Up here, I feel that we've actually lost a little bit at the springtime. And so it's actually an earlier melt out than compared to when we have the onset of winter, where it's just been relatively stable. This year was a bit of an anomaly. We had an early snowpack start to develop in November, and it's really stuck around, which has been great for New England. What we're seeing in the Southwest, though, is a severe deficits of snow that have persisted through much of the season. So here's hoping that some things change and we start to see a little bit more moisture come in as a snowfall for anyone who enjoys outdoor recreation.
For sure. And I was looking through some of the studies you've been involved in. I noticed you were involved in a study about, I think it was atmospheric rivers near Greenland. How are things like atmospheric rivers affected by climate change, and how do they relate to skiing? Because I'm thinking specifically of the Northwest. You have atmospheric rivers out there that sometimes deliver a lot of moisture. Are you noticing shifts in atmospheric rivers based on climate change?
I haven't studied too many atmospheric rivers in the Western United States. I'll make that clear. But what my understanding is that if you have a warmer atmosphere, it can hold more moisture. And so the potential for an atmospheric river to deliver more moisture can increase. And so while there are chances that you will see these great events that are snowfall driven by these atmospheric rivers, you also have a risk of flood, and you also have risk when all of that snow melts. So in terms of trends, it's not something I study specifically, but it is a fascinating subject.
And have you looked into, when we talk about the winter economy, are resorts now having to sort of change how they operate their business because of less snow and shifting seasons of snow and things like that?
Well, what I've been encouraged by is seeing more resorts investing in clean energy infrastructure, putting in more EV charging stations. So when people come to visit, they're not relying on gasoline and fossil fuels to get themselves there through transportation costs. We also see many new lodges putting on solar panels and investing in air source heat pumps. And that's great because it also lowers their energy bills. And that can be a really big addition that helps to lower not just their carbon emissions, but also the energy costs at their bottom line.
So I actually spent a few years working at a climate risk company. And again, this was not a research study we were doing, but we were kind of playing around with the data and looking at things anecdotally. And when we were looking with some of the long-term climate models 25, 50 years into the future, it looked like most of the Earth, including a lot of these ski resorts, were going to generally get warmer over the next 25 to 50 years, even longer than that. Is that generally what you're seeing?
Yes, absolutely. There's no really any location that we expect to get colder in this climate.
And did you also, what I also noticed is when I was trying to look at precipitation projections, who's going to get more precipitation in the future, who's getting less, that gets a little murkier. It's not quite as linear as the temperature projections, right?
Yeah, when we look at future projections and precipitation, there's a lot of uncertainty. And some of the rules of thumb that we generally try to follow are that the wet places get wetter and the dry places are more likely to get drier. It doesn't mean that the northeastern United States would be immune from drought. In fact, we had a drought coming into this last winter season, but it does mean that more of our precipitation is going to be coming in these extreme events.
And I know in the West, especially where I used to live in Colorado, sometimes things like avalanches are a threat. Often that's caused by, uneven layers of snow, wind, and things like that. Does long-term climate change play into that at all, or is that something that still needs to be researched further about, the worsening threat of avalanches?
I mean, as we continue to see more precipitation coming as rain instead of snow in the wintertime, the risk of wet slab avalanches increases as we have these more rapid warming winter weather whiplash events. So, a rapid increase in temperature that also can increase the risk of avalanche. And anytime you end up with unique layers of heavy snow, that can create some instability and also lead to increased risk. What's also concerning is that you're ending up in these spaces. I think Colorado a couple years ago ended up having these historically large avalanches that weren't predicted or even observed in the observational record, so in historical record. So when you get outside of the historical context and into a new space, that's when things become much more unpredictable.
And I always ask every guest that comes on to discuss weather and science topics about social media. I imagine there are benefits and negatives when it comes to social media and studying this topics. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at something like avalanche and backcountry usage has really increased in recent years. So people using skins to go outside of resorts and into terrain that it is not managed by any one sort of company. Instead, it's unmanaged terrain. But we've also not seen a proportionate increase in the number of avalanche fatalities or incidents. So that's been a good sign. It means that people are paying attention and they are taking the time to learn about how to use avalanche gear like a beacon, probe, and shovel. And it also means that they're assessing their risk a little bit better and checking in on the forecasts and saying, this avalanche risk is probably considerable today, and I'm going to stay out of that terrain.
One place that I like to ski in Colorado, Arapahoe Basin, I think the summit is like 13,000 feet. It's super, super high elevation. Are super high elevations also subject, do you think, to this general increase in warming and changing snow patterns?
The general rule of thumb is that if it's a higher elevation, they're going to be a bit more resilient because they're just that much farther from the melting point. So, as warmer temperatures occur in winter over time, places that are at higher elevations are less likely to reach that point. The lower elevations are where we're really seeing some susceptibility.
And here in Arizona, I'll reference Arizona Snow Bowl, the place that I've skied here in Arizona. Do you ever hear about how they're dealing with lift ticket sales differently, especially when there are snow droughts or things like that?
I've never had the pleasure of skiing in Arizona, unfortunately, not yet. I'll say not yet, because maybe someday I'll be able to get down there and do that. But one shift that we have seen is many more consolidated season passes. So people that are selling passes that are available for multiple resorts. And a season pass can really buffer against those types of winters where things are not off to a great start. Someone's already purchased their pass ahead of the season. So in that sense, it provides a bit of a financial buffer against warm winters.
And I was just thinking about people that book ski vacations a couple months in advance. So let's say, you have someone that they booked an amazing ski trip to Arizona, Colorado, the Northeast. And then you get within a week or two of the trip and there's no snow and they want to cancel. Who's losing money in this? Is it the business, the customer? Do they have like insurance for this kind of stuff? I'm just fascinated with how that all can kind of work.
I have not looked into having any insurance for those types of trips. We tend to stay local and do our skiing locally. So yeah, it's up to the consumer as to how they want to react to that. I think once everyone's really excited for a trip, maybe they make the most of it and find another activity to do while they're at the mountain. So in the Northeast, for example, a couple of our resorts have water parks nearby or at the resort property. And that could be tons of fun for the kids, even if the snow's not cooperating.
And when you look at the long-term climate projections, back when I used to work with this stuff a little more closely, I remember the long-term climate models, at least at the time, were classified into sort of worst case scenario, climate change, to best case scenario, and everything in between. Is there one particular scenario that you sort of pick out when you're trying to do these projections now?
Yeah, I used to when I first started my research in the climate world. I typically was looking at what they called very memorable SSP 585, which is not very intuitive to someone who's not in the climate world and climate modeling. But when I think about it now, I think about it as the pre-Paris Agreement scenario. That was the trajectory that we were on prior to agreeing to international collaboration to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and work on clean energy technology. What we're seeing now is that we have pulled away from that worst case scenario, and we're probably closer to well, not quite at the current climate policies, because things are, as you know, shifting really rapidly right now. The United States has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and the United States is currently investing a lot in greenhouse gas emission related fuels like fossil fuels such as oil, gas, and coal. So whether or not we'll trend back to that worst case scenario, I'm hopeful that we won't, and that the rest of the world will continue on a path that is a bit more optimistic. But right now, even with the current climate policies that were in place, even as recently as 2022, we were still looking at snow loss. And I think that can be something really important to accept and to recognize that we need to act and act in a much more significant way than we have in the past. So it's not enough to say that, okay, we've sold this many EV vehicles and we're good. It needs to be much more broader investment in how we're generating our energy and transportation.
So you don't think we're necessarily locked into one particular scenario forever. There's still maybe some wiggle room there.
There is always time to change, and that change can start at a local level or state level. But ideally, we're having an international collaboration where we act to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have seen success on that international stage before when the Montreal Protocol was signed to eliminate ozone producing CFCs. That worked. We now are seeing changes in the ozone hole, so it's shrinking and that it's healing. And that's optimistic. I think that we can do the same when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions.
When you are at a cocktail party or a social event and people find out what you do, especially someone that might be interested in skiing and snow recreation, what is like the number one question that you get? Because I imagine people want to pull you over and talk your ear off about this stuff.
A lot of folks want to know what they can do. And for me, I tell them look into nonprofit groups like Protect Our Winters. I've been working with their Science Alliance for over a decade now, and get on board with what they're working on in terms of policy advancements. Right now in New Hampshire, I'm also looking at my more local governance. So figuring out how our energy subcommittee works in our town and who's on it, and making sure that you most importantly vote. This can be in state, local, or federal elections, and it should be all three. But know who's on the ballot, know what they're voting for, and where they stand with regards to the future for generations ahead of us that want to preserve winter.
And I wanted to loop back because I am a weather nerd. I'm a ski nerd. We're talking about these projections which could make snow turn more into a mix of rain and snow, or maybe rain. Do you think this could longer term have an effect on the consistency of snow that we're skiing on? For instance, people might get different types of skis if you're expecting powder versus wet snow and things like that.
I have to say, I was pretty shocked to see a video. It was a reel that was on Instagram from one of my colleagues in Utah, and what the person was skiing on was very reminiscent of what we call East Coast ice, which you
Yes.
cannot get an edge on. And when I first saw the video, I thought, well, surely that must be in Vermont or New Hampshire. And I was like, wait, we've actually had snow. And then I was shocked to find out that that was Utah. So I wouldn't wish East Coast ice on my worst enemy, but it is probably a likelihood when you have more ephemeral melt, when you're having more frequent rain on snow events, the quality of the snow is not going to be that light, powdery, fluffy stuff. It's going to be a much heavier, wetter snowpack.
That's so interesting that you say that, because as someone that grew up here in the West, I was kind of used to the light, fluffier snow. And when I went to college on the East Coast, I was planning to impress my friends with my amazing skiing skills. And we go up there and they have East Coast ice and I'm falling all over the place. I'm terrible. And they're making fun of me. They're saying things like, hey, I thought you were from Colorado. Why can't you handle this stuff? But there is a difference.
There is a very specialized skill set for handling East Coast ice. Absolutely.
For sure. All right. Are there any final thoughts on this topic that you want to share with us before we depart this edition of the podcast?
I just want to let people know that I still have a lot of hope for winter. I think there's a lot that we can do to come together, to act locally, and to do our own part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save winter for future generations.
Are you a skier yourself? I imagine you are. I think you've mentioned that you've done quite a bit of it, right?
I have. I'm actually, so I'm a split boarder now. So I do a mix of skiing uphill and then I snowboard downhill.
So you're what they call very, very hardcore.
I would like to I would like my kids to think so.
Well, the most important part is impressing your kids, right?
Of course, I want to motivate them.
All right. Well, Dr. Elizabeth Burakowski, thank you so much for being on the Sonoran Sky Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.